Welcome to our course, Don Quijote de la Mancha, the greatest book of all time, at Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala. I'm Eric Graff, your host, and I want to invite you on this journey, which is divided according to 52 chapters, distributed into 3 modules for a total of 21 weeks. In this course, we will attend to a number of issues, but we are particularly concerned with Cervantes' approach to big ideas, such as friendship, justice, loyalty, and heroism. In other words, universal values as important today as they were at the beginning of the 17th century, and which have never been dealt with in any other novel as intensely as they are in Don Quixote de la Mancha. The first part of the course focuses on the 52 chapters of the first part of the novel. Each of the 3 modules consists of 7 weeks, in which we will assess through animated videos, quizzes, illustrations, readings, and discussion forums just how and why Cervantes was interested in religious freedom, political freedom, personal freedom, and even economic freedom. In the first module, we will contemplate the content of chapters 1 through 14. In the second module, we will study chapters 15 through 28. And finally, in the third module, we will deal with chapters 29 through 52. So I invite you to watch the videos, analyze the images that you will find there, and above all, to participate in the online discussion forums, where you can exchange ideas with your colleagues about everything discussed in this course, and even things yet to be discussed. Enjoy. Hello everybody, welcome to Discover Don Quixote, Universidad Francisco Marroquín's online course, MOOC on Don Quixote de la Mancha, the greatest book ever written, according to some people. This is the first live session in English, and we will be talking about the second module of the course. We've already done the first module. Just to review, we had an introduction to Don Quixote. We had his first sally. He showed up at the first inn. He was dubbed a knight. Then we had the episode with Andrés, the shepherd boy, being whipped by the rich farmer Juan Aldudo. We had the encounter with the merchants of Toledo. We had Don Quixote return home on top of his neighbor's ass. A little bit of confusion there with his identity. He called himself Abendarráez and Dulcinea Jarifa, so a little bit of Morisco identity intruding at that point. We had the scrutiny of Don Quixote's books in his library in chapter 6. We had the final appearance of Sancho Panza in chapter 7. Then we had the famous episode of the windmills in chapter 8, the battle with the Basque at the end of that chapter, the lost manuscript of chapter 9, its encounter or its discovery in a marketplace in Toledo. Then we had some interlude discussion of what it is to be a knight errant. We had Don Quixote's famous speech about the golden age before the goat herders in chapter 11. Then we began to turn pastoral, had an introduction to the story of Grisostomo and Marcela. Don Quixote also debates with Vivaldo in chapter 13, and finally at Grisostomo's funeral, the wonderful, beautiful, and angry Marcela appears. That's a review of the first module, which is also on the table. If you have questions about that, we can talk about that. But we would want to focus mostly on the second module today, which begins in chapter 15. We have the adventure with the Yanguesen mares. Rocinante gets a little carried away with himself. We have more discussion about what it means to be a knight errant, with a very interesting detail about the Caballero del Febo and his lavativa made of sand and snow. We have chapter 16. We have Don Quixote and Sancho arriving at the second inn. The wonderful episode of Maritornes, who is attempting to sleep with a mule herder in the same attic that Don Quixote has been lodged in. This mule herder, by the way, is also a distant relative of the author of the first text in Arabic, Fide Mahamete Ben Angeli. That episode, we recall the episode at the end ends in chaos, and a officer of the Holy Brotherhood arrives and plays the part of a kind of detective. The novel gets kind of like an episode from A Shot in the Dark or The Pink Panther, very chaotic, humorous. And we have chapter 17, the story of the balsam of Fierebras, which Don Quixote actually mixes and consumes. Sancho follows suit. It doesn't work out so well for Sancho, you'll recall. Then we have Sancho's blanketing by guests at the inn when Don Quixote and Sancho refuse to pay. Then we have the adventure of the flocks of sheep, an allusion to Achilles in Homer. We also have the dead body episode in chapter 19, very interesting encounter with a procession of people who are carrying a body towards Segovia. Then we have the episode of the fulling mills, the long discussion about Sancho's salary, the interlude that Sancho tells about Lope Ruiz and Torralba. Very scatological conclusion to that scene as Sancho relieves himself right next to Don Quixote. Chapter 21, we have the helmet of Mambrino as Don Quixote attacks a poor innocent barber and steals his basin. Then in chapter 22, we have the famous, very famous, and very controversial episode of the Galeote, the galley slaves. Chapter 23, our heroes must skedaddle, must escape into the Sierra Morena, where they find a valise with money and a poem and some nice shirts. Then they encounter the old goat herder. And finally, we meet the madman Cardenio in chapter 24. We listen to the first part of his story and his love for Luscinda. In chapter 25, Don Quixote, of course, that story ends when Don Quixote interrupts Cardenio and Cardenio attacks him. In chapter 25, we have Don Quixote's penitence. We have the mysterious problem of Sancho's ass. And then Sancho mounts Rocinante and heads off on his embassy to meet with Dulcinea. In chapter 26, Sancho reappears at the second end and meets the curate, the priest, and the barber. And then in chapter 27, taking them back to where Don Quixote is doing penance in the Sierra Morena, we meet Cardenio and get the second part of his story. And then in chapter 28, we finally meet Dorotea. So that's a review of what we've read so far. If you're still with us, congratulations. If you're just starting, welcome. And we should get straight to the questions. Please enter them in the window if you're watching us on YouTube, or at the bottom in the forum if you're watching us on our own website. Okay, so we're going to start. Please tell us your name and where you're from. We're always fascinated to find out where people are watching us from. Question number 1. This is about Module 1. A mysterious person named RF says, when did Christopher Roloffs draw or publish these illustrations, and in what context? The answer is he has not. We have plans to publish them. Christopher is actually working on these drawings as we go. He is presently at work on the end of the 3rd module and starting on part 2. So you are seeing these drawings about as quickly as anyone. I get to see them first, and then pretty much they go straight to the website. So this is the first place these have been published. Okay, question number 2 from Maggie. This is about module number 2. Will Sancho continue questioning Don Quixote's sanity? Okay, that's a big question about the entire rest of the novel, actually. Maggie also asked, or will his mental functioning become more fused with Don Quixote's by the end of the book? That's a wonderful question, Maggie. That's fodder for a master's degree thesis or even a doctoral dissertation. There is a traditional reading of this novel that says that Don Quixote gradually becomes Sanchified, and Sancho gradually becomes more like Don Quixote, becomes more quixotic as the novel proceeds, so that the two characters sort of switch positions between parts 1 and parts 2. Will he question Don Quixote? Say he will always be there as a check to Don Quixote's sanity. At some point in part 2, however, around chapter 10, we'll notice that Sancho is more interested in maintaining Don Quixote's madness or maintaining the illusion. So that's a very good question, and the answer is yes and no, and he will become more like Don Quixote towards the end of the book. Okay, so moving along, question number 3 from Dapple-Dung. Well, that's really crude of you, Dapple-Dung. This is about module 1. Dapple-Dung says, my footnotes say that the Hidalgo was a person of well-to-do ancestry, at least to a certain degree. I think it's going to be important to understand the socioeconomic environment of the time. Of course, excellent instincts, Dapple-Dung. The economy was definitely not open or free for anyone except those who were already born to privilege. But where does Don Quixote fit in? Who did he come from? How did he acquire enough wealth to be a landowner and have hired help for his estate? These are all very good and difficult questions. It's important not to think of the Hidalgo as particularly rich. There's a wide range, but they are the lower of the lowest nobility in Castile. In the late 16th century, they're famous for being impoverished. If you wanted to continue to draw your pension from the state as part of your Hidalgo status for serving the state as a kind of a mercenary army in southern Spain in case of Moorish attacks, you actually could not work. So Hidalgos are famous for refusing to work. Their status prohibits them from working, and they wouldn't stoop to it, right? But that's a problem. With inflation and with the monetary policy being problematic, their pension is not going as far as it used to. And we can assume that Don Quixote is actually pretty poor. And there were others of his caste that were much poorer. So that's a great question. You need to keep the socioeconomic context in mind when reading this book. Where did Don Quixote come from? That's difficult to say. There's several moments in the text where we'll see he claims to be a direct descendant from a famous 15th century hero. He claims to be of title, a special kind of Hidalgo. Where did he acquire the wealth to become a landowner? Well, apparently he inherited his estate. But it's not as wealthy. He's not as wealthy as you would think. More of a poor farmer. Okay, question number 4. RF again. RF asks about Module 1. I wonder about the references to the various authors and the names for Don Quixote and the vagueness, which must be intentionally symbolic of something. I would also like to know how popular those novels of chivalry actually were in Cervantes' day. Were they bestsellers, or like Don Quixote's clothes, were they actually outdated? No, they're bestsellers. These are big hits. This is a good way to make a lot of money, and they are constantly re-edited, reprinted. There's continuations written of them. They really are a big hit, and we see that in the characters of the novel. They are fanatic fans of these novels, and that's reflecting the reality of the day. Now, they'd already been criticized heavily by the humanists at the beginning of the 16th century. So one thing is, are chivalric novels still popular? And another question is, were they out of favor among the intellectuals of the day? And the answer to that question is yes. For about 75 years, they've already been completely criticized and dismissed by the humanists. So that's a very good question. Regarding the various authors and the different names for Don Quixote, it's clearly intentional and clearly symbolic of something. I think it has to do with the instability of Don Quixote's identity. Who is he? Who knows? We're supposed to ask, and we're supposed to be interested. And regarding the authors, again, one of them is Arabic or Moorish. There's several Christian narrators. There's a Morisco translator involved. So this is, again, about that hybrid mixed culture and ethnic context of southern Spain. So that's excellent questions, RF. Question number 5 from Dwight G., also about Module 1. I'm curious as to Galdós, the Galdós reference in Lesson 1. For now, we must begin in the beginning, by beginning, as Galdós once wrote at the beginning of a novel whose name I won't remember. The last part's mine, whose name I won't remember. I'm parroting the beginning of Cervantes' novel. But Galdós, you need to look at La Sombra, the shadow, very much based on Anselmo, the story of Anselmo, which we're supposed to talk about in Module 3. So Galdós was a huge fan of Cervantes. Clearly, he was a novelist from late 19th century Spain. He would have been unable to avoid the influence of Cervantes. Okay, question 6. Shelley from Atlanta, Georgia. Wow. What was Cervantes' inspiration for this novel? Shelley, wow, that's really complex. There's autobiographical elements to this text. He's clearly confessing or saying something about himself. He appears to endorse the humanists' criticism of the novels of chivalry, finding them to be lascivious and violent and therefore not worthy of a serious Christian reader's interest. I'm not sure how serious we should accept that. He also just clearly wanted to be a great writer. This is kind of his version of an epic. He thinks of himself as a Homer or a Virgil of late 16th century Spain. And I think once he got around chapter 8, chapter 9, he realized he had something very big on his hands. So we shouldn't eliminate the possible motive or inspiration of money. We'll talk about that at the end of the 3rd module. That's a great question, Shelley. It's a huge question. I hope I've answered it sufficiently. Okay, so if there's anyone else out there who has a question, please volunteer it. The lines are open, as we say. And if you don't ask me questions, then I will simply babble on about Don Quixote to my heart's content. Let's see. I want to go back to that question of inspiration. I think Cervantes is also angry. I think he's upset about his own mistreatment after the Battle of Lepanto and having spent 5 years as a slave in Algiers. I think he's slightly resentful. He's also been a tax collector in southern Spain, so he's seen how the society is evolving and how things are going. So I think there's a definite inspiration here to criticize. We could call it the voice of the loyal opposition. I'm not saying Cervantes was a traitor to Spain, but I think he's extremely critical of Habsburg policy, military, monetary, political policy in Spain. So I would include that as a very large inspiration. Okay, so we're still waiting on more questions. You know, there are no silly questions. All questions are valid. And if you ask a stupid question, that's okay too. I'll answer any question about Don Quixote. Okay. Okay. We can talk about the next module, or we can talk about themes that we should be noticing. Let's talk in particular about this galley slaves episode in part 2. There's something very interesting about this encounter. Don Quixote liberates these men. Are they guilty? Why are they being condemned basically to death? Many of them for very petty crimes. One of them stole a shirt. Another man had sex with his cousin. These are things that I'm not sure Cervantes, even in that day, felt deserved this very heavy punishment of being sent to row in the king's galleys, which was pretty much a death sentence. Some people survived, but galley slaves are the prime target in any military encounter, and because they're chained, and most of them didn't know how to swim, if things went wrong, they were pretty much dead. The interesting thing about the Battle of Lepanto, which Cervantes was always very proud of, is that the general of the Christian forces, Don Juan de Austria, Philip II's illegitimate brother, actually promised the galley slaves their freedom if the Christian fleet won the battle. The Christian fleet won the battle and then some. It was a rout. They crushed the Turkish navy. Unfortunately for Don Juan of Austria, he did not have the authority to make that promise, and no galley slaves were freed. So that, I think, is an interesting socio-political or military context for that particular episode. I believe it was RF. No, it was Dappeldung, who said that we should keep in mind the socio-economic environment of the time. We should also keep in mind Cervantes' own life that provides context for the novel, and the military and political history of Spain at that time. And that particular betrayal by Don Juan of Austria seems to me is very important when considering the galley slaves episode. It might explain why Don Quixote frees these men, why Don Quixote really never admits that it was wrong to have freed these men, and why Cervantes would have brought it up at all. Okay, so we don't have any more questions. I guess we will close. We can wait. We can see if someone else will enter a question. If not, then we hope everyone continues reading. We will have another session, another live session on Wednesday in Spanish this time. So if you're reading it in English and you speak Spanish, you might want to tune in. It should be interesting. Please think of your questions or reformulate these in Spanish if you can. Be happy to try and answer them in Spanish. That will be at the same time, 5 p.m. Guatemalan time, which is 6 p.m. East Coast time in the U.S., 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. We'll have the same format. We'll go over Module 2, and we'll ask people to ask questions in Spanish. So if there are no more questions, we will close and say good evening, and hope to see you all again the next time. Thank you for some really terrific questions. Very difficult, some of them. Okay. Hasta luego. Nos vemos. Adiós.